Hello ladies and gents. So this first lesson of the double today, we'll be looking at the tropical rainforest, specifically more at the carbon cycle and then the water cycle, to kind of finish off our Indonesian rainforest example. And we will then be starting to look at our second example for water and carbon, so our second big case study for water and carbon, which will be the River X. So we'll make a start to that at the second half of this double. Now, when we're talking about changes to deforestation that are causing changes to the water, water and carbon cycle, that are caused by changes as a result of deforestation in the rainforest, I think it's very important that we think about a variety of scales when we're talking about that. So on a local scale, river drainage basins will see an increase in discharge from rainfall events, so more flashy response to rainfall events, and that's typically because there is going to be less interception from vegetation, so there is likely to be more surface runoff, so more water will get into the river systems quickly. On a national scale, river discharges are likely to decrease overall, as there will probably be less moisture in the atmosphere because you won't have the trees recycling the water and transpiring to release water into the atmosphere, so chances are there will probably be less rainfall on a longer term. And on a regional scale, again, climate could completely change with patterns of precipitation being altered completely because you don't have the moisture being put into the atmosphere by the rainforest environment. So actually, when we're talking about water and carbon, it's very useful to look at a variety of scales when we're talking about the impacts of deforestation in the tropical rainforest. And those are all water examples. This lesson we're going to focus very much on carbon examples. And you guys might remember carbon budgets. So what I'd just like you to do quickly, if you want to pause the video to do this, is to calculate the carbon budget for the rainforest before deforestation and the carbon budget for the rainforest after deforestation. So here is the information on the left-hand side, shows before deforestation, so in our original rainforest. So you can see the inputs and the outputs and the various different stores of carbon. And then on the right-hand side of this slide, you will see 10 years after deforestation. You can see the various inputs and outputs and changes to the size of stores. So if you can, do the calculation for the carbon budgets for the rainforest before and after deforestation. And as I said, if you want to pause this video to do that quickly, you're welcome to. So, rainforests and carbon. Rainforests are the second, or tropical rainforest is the second largest absorber of carbon per square kilometre from photosynthesis as an ecosystem. The largest absorption rate is actually coral reef, but the second largest from photosynthesis is tropical rainforest, which means they are an incredibly important carbon sink. And in the natural conditions, the tropical rainforest climate promotes plant growth. It's basically the ideal conditions for plant growth. You have a very consistent length to the day because there isn't a kind of seasonal change in the length of the day as you get in, say, in the UK. And generally speaking, it is warm throughout the whole year. So this very consistent temperature and weather conditions means that carbon is absorbed very readily by photosynthesis, and it means that there are ideal conditions for plant growth. And that means throughout the year, huge quantities of carbon dioxide are absorbed from the atmosphere, and because it is photosynthesis taking place, huge amounts of oxygen are released in return. And that is why you might sometimes hear the rainforest environments referred to as the lungs of the earth. And indeed, when we're talking about the Indonesian rainforests, it is a very significant carbon sink within Asia. Unfortunately though, as we've seen, quite a lot of the rainforest is being cleared, and in Indonesia, the most popular method of clearance is clearance by burning, which is also referred to as slash and burn. So have a little think about what you think the impacts will be on the carbon cycle, and are there any other impacts that might perhaps give feedback that will cause changes perhaps in the carbon cycle or indeed in another system. So if you want a minute or so just to discuss this amongst yourselves, and then pause the video and then feel free to restart it once you have had that little discussion. So some of the impacts of burning. Obviously the first impact of burning is that there is a sudden stop to all photosynthesis because you kill off all of the vegetation. And really that's going to take several months, if not even years in some cases, for vegetation actually to return to the area. Because the ash initially is quite difficult to grow on, but then the ash will give sort of fertile conditions for a brief amount of time. But yeah, the first thing is that you stop photosynthesis entirely, so your rainforest environment is no longer taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so it stops being a carbon sink. The second thing it does is it changes the ecosystem. Not all plants are going to be resistant to fire, so their seeds and things are not going to survive. And some other vegetation are resistant to fire, so they will become the dominant vegetation and will establish kind of a colony, colonize the area and become the dominant species of plant. And that then impacts what other species you will have there in the future. Obviously, when you do burn the forest as well, all respiration stops on a local scale for a short amount of time because you are taking away all of the living organisms, so all of the plants and animals. So you don't have carbon being put into the atmosphere through that. But some carbon is going to be put into the atmosphere from the burning itself. But also the burnt wood and so on will add carbon to the soil. And the rain will wash the ash into the ground, increasing the soil carbon content. And some of it will be washed away into the rivers through surface runoff. And that changes the pH, so the acidity and the alkalinity of the soil and the water, which then has a knock-on impact on both of these ecosystems. So the water, particularly if it changes the pH of the water, that can have a lot of negative impacts on marine life. And we will then obviously as well lose quite a lot of the decomposers, because most of the decomposers, particularly things like the bacteria, will be very sensitive to temperature. So as a result of the burning, they are probably going to have been killed off. So again, there is no respiration taking place from them. So you are basically putting a stop to quite a lot of the carbon transfers that are taking place in our tropical rainforest system. So another little task I would like you guys to complete. So in groups of 2 or 3, make a list of the impacts on the carbon cycle for these 5 different things. So arable farming, which is farming to get crops, so plant crops, cattle ranching, mining, palm oil, and urbanization. And I will give you guys 5 minutes to make this list and then 5 minutes to share it with the class. So if you just want to pause the video and do that in your groups. So you will hopefully have fed back on the different impacts for those different activities that are taking place in rainforest environments. I think when we're talking about Indonesia, really the palm oil is going to be one of the most major ones, and then obviously mining when we look at the Indomet coal project. But before we get onto that, there are a few videos on this presentation that I would like you to watch. So there's 4 little videos about palm oil and Indonesia. So if you could watch those, it is saved in the files area of the team. It's lesson 3, I think, if I remember myself. Yeah, so it's Tropical Rainforest lesson 3 is the one that you are looking at for here. So if you guys can watch those as a class and make notes on them. There are a number of news articles as well, so if you want to do some further reading, so there's news articles about the palm oil industry and the rates of deforestation that are taking place currently in Indonesia. And then once you've done that, if you can complete the activities on page 51, which if you could hand in, I think that's actually the wrong date, it's Friday the 16th of November, I don't think it's a Friday. So if you could hand those in by Friday the 13th, sorry, I put in 6 rather than 3, so Friday the 13th of November, and that would be good. And if you want to make a start to those, and then at the start of the second lesson, if you can press the play button on the second video, which will be looking more at the River Exe.